This video brought to you by my patrons at Patreon, as well as those who've decided to tip me through Cashapp and Venmo. Thank you so much for everything you do. Hello, and welcome to the Church of Mothman YouTube channel. So, I haven't been here for a while, over a year in fact, and quite a bit has happened since then. Obviously, the rebranding happened. It took me a while to get my footing on what I wanted my social media presence to be, and I think we're finally here. No one really prepares you for internet micro-celebrity status. It just sort of happens. There are other things I'd like to discuss with y'all, but I'm gonna wait until the end of the video, so stay tuned after the credits because I have some really cool and exciting stuff to share. Now, let me take you to church. So today we're going to be talking about womanhood, because the question, what is a woman, seems to be on everyone's mind lately. And while we've heard the voices of many trans women on this issue, defending their womanhood, and rightfully so, there's one group of people whose voices tend to be lacking in this discussion, and that's trans men. The only trans man people really seem to want to talk to is Buck Angel, who transitioned like 40 years ago and whose views are outdated, to say the least. And while Elliot Page has certainly made his feelings clear, he seems either too busy or too apprehensive to really engage with the discourse. Which is totally fine, by the way. By all means, Elliot, sweet boy, protect your peace, and I mean that genuinely. But as much as people don't want to talk to us, people talk about us often. Hell, Abigail Schreier wrote an entire book about us, and yet it's pretty rare to actually get the perspective of trans men. Most trans men I see are actually trans men who've detransitioned, as former trans men are often used as props for right-wing agendas. Either that, or they're pregnant men who are used more often than not as modern-day freak shows, something for the internet to gawk at and be scandalized by. And while the vitriol and disgust of TERFs is most focused on trans women, they have a uniquely problematic interpretation of the experience of trans men as well. In fact, a good portion of J.K. Rowling's essay TERF Wars is exclusively focused on trans men. So if we're going to ask, what is a woman? I feel like perhaps it could be helpful to hear the perspective of someone who has cast womanhood off entirely. And while I might not be able to enlighten people on what a woman is, I might be able to offer some clarity on what it isn't, at least in practice. And to do that, I have to make, at least this first part, all about me. Look, I'm a tran on the internet and a Leo. I honestly don't know what you were expecting. So, let's revisit a little animated classic from the early 2000s. So, I was coming of age when the DreamWorks animated classic Shrek came into existence. Now, most people have seen Shrek. It's practically a cultural icon at this point, so I'm going to save the lengthy overview. We all know the story. An ogre, in an attempt to get a ragtag group of fantasy creatures off his property, agrees to help a wealthy lord rescue a princess from a tower, only to find that he's in love with the princess and that she secretly turns into an ogre at night. Hijinks ensue, and at the end, the princess decides she'd rather live as an ogre with Shrek than live as a human with the lord. They get their happily ever after, the end. Now, as I said, this movie came out around the time I was beginning puberty. In fact, I remember getting my first period within months of its release date, and I was already budding breasts, a fact I was horrified by, despite my parents actually giving me a fairly comprehensive education on the topic. I was also coming to terms with the fact that I felt a certain type of way about the fairer sex, something that I, being raised in a religious household, was also horrified by. On top of all of this, I was diagnosed with the autoimmune disorder alopecia universalis, a disorder that is characterized by full body hair loss, and is the reason I still have limited body hair. Basically, adolescence was hell, and it's something I'm still unpacking in therapy. So, as I was maturing, I started growing into a body that no longer felt like mine. A body that, at times, didn't even feel entirely human. And as I entered high school, that feeling was confirmed by pretty much everyone around me. I was tall and broad-shouldered and bald, with a massive rack that made me look even bigger. And the thing is, everything except the giant rack I was pretty cool with. But the people around me certainly were not. I was dragged to every wig store in the state. Every morning I was forced to pencil in my eyebrows, no matter how tired I was, awake at 5 a.m. to catch the rural school bus. I was hot and itchy and uncomfortable. My clothes felt like a costume I had draped over myself, a mask. The girls at school started referring to me as Shrek, a nickname that hurt me so deeply that for nearly 2 decades, I wasn't even able to engage with that piece of media at all. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a woman or a man, but a thing. An ogre in a dress, performing womanhood to the best of its ability. If I went out without a wig, I was, more often than not, perceived as a man, especially when I dressed more butch. I was often accused of going into the wrong bathroom, something many butch women experience. In his book, Female Masculinity, a book about the experiences of butch women, Jack Halberstam writes about how women's bathrooms have always been used as a political tool for the enforcement of gender conformity, to the point that being confronted by security or employees of an establishment about what bathroom you were using is a standard feature of the butch narrative. And if I wasn't being harassed in the bathrooms, it was the locker room, where I learned the first and most important rule of being butch in a room full of women. Don't make eye contact with the femmes. The other girls can laugh and joke and talk, but that shit is not for you. Change in the stall, lest some cheerleader think you're staring at her in a sexual way and not a "my lithium is making me dissociate" way, at which point you've earned yourself a trip to the principal's office. I wasn't treated as a girl or as a boy. I was treated as a monster. My anger and sadness were always seen as something inherently dangerous, instead of the lamenting of a literal child in desperate need of care and gentleness. But I was never granted that. I was always seen as stronger, tougher, and more capable than the other girls around me, even though I wasn't. Combine that with a slew of mental health problems, an inability to understand social cues, and poor emotional regulation skills, and people treated me like I was one bad day from rampaging through the village. To the people around me, I wasn't a child. I was a 5-foot, 11-inch creature who was inherently violent. I never got into a fight at school. Not one. And yet I was seen as more dangerous than the girls who slammed each other with lunch trays and ripped each other's hair out because Billy Caldwell chose to ask one of them to homecoming and not the other. In fact, to this day, most of the physical altercations I've been in have been where I'm on the receiving end of domestic violence. Because despite how I look, I usually don't fight back, especially with people I care about. I've rarely had to get into fights because I am big enough and loud enough that most people decide upon looking at me that they don't want to risk tangling with me. Especially men, who don't want to risk the possibility of their honor being tainted by someone who was assigned female at birth. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been mugged and assaulted enough at this point that I've had to learn how to hold my own, but even then, I'm holding my own. The goal isn't to beat the other person into submission, it's to escape, or better yet, avoid the situation altogether. And if you think that's cowardly, I ask you, is that a label you would have ascribed to a feminine teenage girl? Or even a feminine adult woman? Because yeah, my relative size does give me a bit of an advantage in an altercation, but I still don't like getting beaten up. At least, not outside of very specific circumstances. And this was something that followed me into adulthood. I once had a coworker who was truly shocked I had never been in a knife fight. He just assumed I had been. Hell, in the last 2 months, I had my former white lady boss fire me while shaking and crying because I was scary. Meanwhile, I was sitting in her office wearing flamingo earrings. Now, was she honestly intimidated by me? I'm not sure, but she was sure as hell pissed that I had gone over her head and eventually to social media about her poor management. And she sure had no problem pulling the "I'm so scared" card when it suited her. Actually, one of the things she cited as frightening was the fact I didn't make eye contact with her, despite the fact you don't make eye contact with the femmes. Y'all white ladies really need to figure out if you're more scared of minorities looking at you or not looking at you. Seriously, we all need to know. Tell us the truth, Joanne! Now, before we go any further, I think we should pause to ask ourselves something. Why is the question, "What is a woman?" even being asked? And I do think I can answer that somewhat. Transgender people are experiencing a great deal of visibility right now. Before now, at least in America, we were largely pushed into the dark corners of nightclubs and bathhouses. The political actions of people like Marsha P. Johnson, while not forgotten, were largely swept under the rug, and the rights and desires of white gay men and lesbians were pushed to the forefront of the queer liberation movement. But now that gay marriage has been achieved, and in many ways, gay men, bisexuals, and lesbians have integrated into society, trans people are finally starting to see their day in the sun. Transgender medicine is becoming more accessible, and more young people are being given the tools to figure out the way they want to express themselves earlier in life. We are a group of people that many Americans, and white Western people in general, have never really interacted with. And a lot of people are afraid of what they don't understand, or at the very least, curious. On the surface, I actually think what is a woman is an incredibly interesting philosophical question. The standards of womanhood vary vastly across time and culture, and I think that's an amazing question to explore in good faith. The problem is, TERFs like J.K. Rowling and conservatives like Matt Walsh aren't asking in good faith. They want to push a political agenda. And that's really sad, because what could have been a genuine exercise in human curiosity has now been tainted by bigotry. A question that could have given us a greater understanding of humanity as a whole is now difficult to separate from a political ideology that seeks to wipe out trans people altogether. You see, when a group of people starts being framed as a question, it's rarely a great thing historically. What is a woman isn't the actual question being asked here. If that was truly the question being asked, Matt Walsh would have compiled cross-cultural references from throughout the world and throughout time. But he didn't do that, because that would have come into conflict with his political ideology that men are men and women are women, and that there are natural hierarchies that have existed since the dawn of time and will continue to live on for millennia. He would have to face the fact that his entire worldview is kind of just bullshit. Do you really think that Matt Walsh spent that much time and money to go to Africa and ask the Maasai people what is a woman without doing research on what African tribes would validate his worldview? Had he chosen a tribe at random, he may have spoken to the Igbo or Yoruba tribes, who don't have a gender binary and usually wait to assign gender later in life. If Matt Walsh was genuinely curious about the nuances of gender and how it's seen cross-culturally, it would have been in his best interest to interview both the Maasai and the Igbo people in order to achieve greater cultural understanding. Even in the US, Matt Walsh frames the gender studies professor he's talking to as too boring to listen to, too long-winded to be taken seriously. He settles for a third-grade understanding of gender because he assumes his audience is stupid, that they want a short, easy answer with no nuance. If you made a documentary where you asked, "What is math?" and you didn't allow the subject matter to be explored past basic multiplication, your documentary wouldn't be very good unless it was specifically made for third graders. What about algebra, trigonometry, geometry? And yes, I would find that to be an extremely boring documentary, but it would be an accurate one. Sometimes topics are complicated and boring. That's just the nature of academia. That's why I do the lighting and the costumes for these videos, to keep people engaged with what I'm trying to say. The question that is really being asked isn't, what is a woman? The question being asked is, why do queer people exist? And what do we do about them? And while the first part of that question is morally neutral, the second part isn't. Asking why queer people exist is a question very similar to, what is a woman? In the sense that, if asked and explored in good faith, can help us come to a greater understanding of humanity. But the second part of the question is where things get a bit rocky. Because, what do you mean? What do we do about queer people? It frames queer people as a problem that needs fixing instead of a group of individuals who deserve equal rights. But, in the spirit of curiosity, let's engage with this inherently bad faith question in good faith. I thought that it was only appropriate to put on my fairy princess outfit for this portion of the video. You guys wanted to see Femme. You got Femme, right? This is what I would look like if I had decided not to transition. Like a knockoff Dolly Parton drag queen. Jolene, 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 Jolene. I could sing pre-T. It's not the case anymore. Irreversible damage. But, back to the question at hand. So, why do queer people exist? Well, first you have to define what queerness is, which is already up for debate, but for the sake of brevity, we will define queerness as someone whose sexual orientation or gender identity falls outside the standards set by white American colonial society. Frankly, the question, what is queerness, could be its own video, and one I may actually make someday. But if we spend too much time here, this video is going to be outrageously long, and despite my bisexual lighting, elaborate costuming, and tendency towards substance abuse, I am not ContraPoints. But back to the question, I keep getting distracted. And the answer is, no one really knows. Several theories have been presented over the years, from there being a gay gene to mothers having higher estrogen or testosterone levels while pregnant. Some people think queerness happens because of trauma or societal conditioning. Some people think queer people just sold their... Oh my fucking god, this goddamn cat. This goddamn... Come here. Some people think queer people sold their soul to the devil. Transgender identity itself has had its own plethora of theories behind it. From the theory that trans people were neglected by parental figures, to the theory that trans identity is the result of rape trauma, to the most harmful theory, autogynephilia, which asserts that trans people simply have a fetish that they act out publicly. And as queer people, we've had to justify our right to exist and explain our lives to people who want short, concise answers so often that the community settled on a nice, short, catchy slogan. We were born this way. It's nice and simple and hard for lawmakers to argue with. After all, if someone is born with some sort of inherent trait, it is easier to make a case for equal rights or to defend ourselves against discrimination. It's the same reason many trans people still tell cis people that we were born in the wrong body. Is it entirely accurate? No. But explaining the complexity and nuance of gender to cis people, who likely have never even thought about it, is an exhausting uphill battle most of the time. And Lord knows we are all tired. The problem arises when a slogan is so vague that the opposition starts poking holes in it. They pull an exhaustive list of theories, those with merit and without, and use them as proof of our deception or ineptitude. We can say we're born this way, but then the opposition will say that trans identity is just the result of some kink or perversion, and we must be stopped because, oh God, what about the children? What about the children? What about the children?
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
And we can't really argue with that, because as much as our lived experience can tell us that isn't true, at that point, it's just he said, she said, or they said. Even more than that, there simply is no solid answer for why queer people exist. For all anyone knows, we could all just be possessed by the ghost of Oscar Wilde. We can't disprove them, because there just isn't an answer. Or there could be multiple answers. Sissies, or men who enjoy wearing women's clothing as a sexual fetish, do exist, as much as trans people don't like to think about it. And Republican politicians are only one hair trigger away from bringing sissy porn onto the Senate floor as proof of our degeneracy. What complicates this situation even more is that a lot of trans people use kink as a stepping stone to safely cross-dress in a way that doesn't make them feel vulnerable. On a somewhat related note, drag, though it is a performance art and not inherently sexual in any way, can also be used as a stepping stone for trans identity, a safe place to experiment with gender. But as much as we can say drag queens and sissies and trans people are all different things, with some crossover, that crossover is always going to be heavily scrutinized by people whose main objective is to wipe us out. To them, cross-dressing is cross-dressing, and it's a perverted form of degeneracy no matter what. To them, every drag queen and trans person is the same as a sissy. To them, every one of us is acting out a sexual fantasy, even though that simply isn't based in reality. This is why many trans people are very uncomfortable with the idea of drag queens and sissies. They see drag queens as a costume of their identity, and sissies as giving credibility to harmful theories about gender identity. So, do autogynephiles exist? I mean, yeah, probably. I've never met one, but this is the world. There's lots of different people in it. There's like 7.5 billion people on this planet. I'm sure there's at least a few people who identify that way, though it certainly doesn't account for the vast majority of the trans experience. I'm of the mindset that there just isn't an answer for why queer people exist, or that there's a million answers for why queer people exist. In fact, I think it's possible that why queer people exist could be as individualized and expansive as the queer community itself. But it's very difficult to engage with these topics because even me making this video could have political consequences. People like Matt Walsh and Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro aren't looking for the truth. They aren't asking questions out of curiosity, and their worldview doesn't encourage scientific exploration or debate. It smothers it. It keeps the people who would be most valuable to these conversations from coming forward about their experiences for fear that they might do or say something that puts the entire community at risk. By making this video and engaging with these topics, I am putting my community at risk. But if we don't engage honestly with the pieces of human experiences that make us uncomfortable, we can never find liberation. People have always been shaped by various forms of nature and nurture for as long as we've existed. The only reason queer people have to try to find an explanation is because society decided that being queer was something inherently bad to be. But we don't owe that to anyone. If a cis man was asked 50 times a day why he kept dating redheads and speculating into his subconscious desires, he would probably find that incredibly invasive and annoying. It might even be considered harassment if it became frequent enough. But when it comes to transgender identity, we are not just expected to deal with people invading our privacy, but we are required to engage with it for our own well-being. We have to find a reason, in hopes that one day we will be left alone to do as we please. And for some people, no reason we give is going to be good enough. If we say it's nurture, then they'll try conversion therapy to change it. If we say it's nature, they'll slice open our brains and drain every drop of our blood until they've found whatever tumor or gene or strand of DNA makes us this way. And the thing is, even then, they could be wrong, because maybe some people are queer because of trauma, and maybe some people were born that way. And maybe some people just saw the cover of the Eurythmics' Touch album and decided that's what they wanted to look like. And these people know this. And they know that the best way to get rid of us is to just eliminate us entirely. That's why they compare us to vermin and disease. They want to assimilate who they can for the sake of public relations, and they want to wipe the rest of us out. I don't care how queer people are made, because it's not wrong to be queer. We're not hurting anyone. We're not degenerating society. We're moving it forward. We're moving it into an age of peace and prosperity and equality, and that scares the ever-living dog shit out of the old guard who have built an empire on the backs of the oppressed. I don't think society deserves any more explanations. I don't think we should say we are born this way, or that trans women are women, or that love is love, or whatever new slogan a couple of white guys living in the Castro came up with. I think we should be granted liberation because we are people, and what we do, or how we dress, or what we decide to do with our bodies is up to us. I think we should be granted liberation because we are so much more than what we've been allowed to be. It doesn't matter how we got here. We are here. And we aren't going anywhere. Oh my god, fuck this. Oh, I don't know how drag queens stay in wigs that long. So for all of you starting tea, it does reduce your hairline. I know that some of the detransitioners didn't seem to really look into that too much, but I don't know how they didn't read it on the massive list of side effects your doctor gives you before you transition. Now that we've set the tone and explained why the framing of the question, what is a woman, is being asked in bad faith, I feel like now we can start to explore how society actually views gender. Because while there are two pre-established boxes society has created for man and woman based on primary and secondary sex characteristics, they have also created a set of rules and standards that one must obey or fall into in order to be considered a real man or woman. There's this common misconception that trans people just don't understand biology. But it's pretty absurd to think that. We're actually acutely aware of our biology. That's why we want to change it. And there are certain things that we can change and certain things that we can't. We know we can't change our chromosomes, Ben Shapiro. We know. We do not care. The only reason any trans person would want to do that is to make you shut the hell up about it. Radfems occasionally use this biology argument, but it's far more common that they use the argument of male and female socialization, basically arguing that because trans women didn't have a girlhood, they are incapable of understanding the female experience. It always blows my mind when Radfems explain girlhood to me, because the girlhood they describe is so different from what I actually experienced. I was not treated as some delicate flower. In fact, I was regularly expected not to be. I was the oldest child, often overburdened with responsibility, and even when I tried to engage in more feminine interests, I was often cast into a masculine role. I was rarely underestimated. If anything, my abilities were far overestimated, to the point I was regularly crushed under the pressure. Men didn't catcall me or look at my tits. If anything, my tits were simply an extension of my large frame. Not sexual objects, but lumps of fat strapped to my chest without my consent. I didn't get rid of my breasts because men were looking at them. I got rid of them because I had to look at them. And in my opinion, they simply did not belong there. About the only experience of girlhood I had was the fact that men couldn't keep their hands to themselves. And not only is that an experience that many young boys will have as well, But if you're defining girlhood through rape and molestation, I would say that has some pretty dark implications. Now, I'm sure some red femme is going to pop into my comment section and be like, just because you aren't treated like a girl doesn't mean you weren't one. It's just your internalized misogyny. And like, okay, but I didn't want to be a girl, and I wasn't being treated like a girl, so why is me becoming a man an issue? I don't have a problem with big butch women. If that's how you want to live, go right on ahead. No one is stopping butch women from being butch women, but I'm not a butch woman. And trying to explain why is no easier than me trying to explain why I love who I love. Because womanhood and manhood and love and happiness are all things that are experienced very differently by every single individual on Earth. TERFs generally see trans men as pitiable victims of the patriarchy. Autistic lesbians far too fragile and incompetent to make their own decisions, who are pressured by doctors to mutilate their bodies. They lament about the end of butch lesbians and tomboys, as if they always treated butch lesbians and tomboys with respect. They accuse us of playing dress-up, as if we think our clothing choices are what make us men. They treat trans men as helpless women who desperately wanted to conform to masculinity in order to be taken seriously and gain upward mobility in the world. But babes, look at me. Do I look like I'm conforming to masculinity? Or to anything, for that matter? I was not particularly a tomboy. I enjoyed theater. I enjoyed pop music. I learned to shoot a bow and arrow at a young age, but that was just because I grew up in a rural area, and my grandfather decided I needed to learn how to shoot something, and he sure as hell didn't trust me not to blow out my own brains by handing me a gun. And this masculinization is not an experience unique to butches. It's something forced onto black women and girls as well. Butch women and black women are generally seen as stronger, more aggressive, and more masculine than their white femme counterparts. Black women's anger and sadness is seen as dangerous and scary, more likely to end in violence. And it certainly isn't because black women or butch women are inherently more violent. These groups of people are simply seen as less deserving of compassion, gentleness, or delicacy than white femme women. And black women can be the most feminine girls in the room and still be seen that way. They can put flowers in their hair and a pink sparkly dress on and still be seen as more aggressive than a white femme in a suit jacket and a skirt. Look at the reactions to black women and girls in media. When a young black girl was cast as Rue in the Hunger Games, people had a fit because she wasn't innocent enough. And that was a literal child, a baby. Y'all had a fit over a baby being cast in the role of a baby, as if black girls are somehow less fragile or innocent than white girls. Now, there are obviously some nuances to comparing butch women to black women that I'm not at all qualified to speak on, especially when it comes to the intersection of being black and butch. But that being said, I do see how a lot of TERFs treat black female athletes and the frequency at which they try to label black female athletes secret men, even those with traditionally feminine presentations like Serena Williams. There was also the controversy about the Women's March logo, where TERFs used phrenology-level pseudoscience to try to prove that one of the profiles used in the logo was a secret trans woman, despite many cis women having a similar profile. So if butch women don't fit this definition of womanhood, and trans women don't fit this definition of womanhood, and women of color often don't fit this definition of womanhood, and women with slightly larger noses than average don't fit this definition of womanhood either, then who is a woman according to this deeply flawed standard? The biological definition is reductive because not all people who have a vagina are treated the same way. It has no basis in reality and is, frankly, a chronically online take that pays zero attention to how people are actually treated in real life. And trans women can get vaginoplasty, yet TERFs still won't see them as women. Are people who bear children women? Because what if a woman can't or doesn't want to do that? Are we really going to strip womanhood down to reproduction? In the year of our Lord 2022, TERFs claim that womanhood is a shared set of experiences, but what experiences? Because I guarantee that many trans women have more shared experiences with cis women than I do. I don't agree with Blair White on most things, but can you honestly look at her and say I have experienced more misogyny than she has? Have an old woman living in Cambodia and a woman living in California had the same girlhood experiences? What about a rich woman and a poor woman? What about a woman living in 1876 and a woman alive today? Does womanhood begin and end with a uterus? Is that really all that TERFs think it is? And even then, what if you get a hysterectomy? Does your womanhood evaporate? I've also noticed that TERF ideology seems to be a phenomenon amongst white, Western, middle to upper class women who are, more often than not, femme-presenting. There are a few butches and androgynes thrown into the mix, but we'll discuss them later in the video. The vast majority of TERFs are femme-presenting, including Queen TERF herself, who often describes the assumedly cis female villains in her novels as overweight and masculine, traits that could be ascribed to many butch-presenting women. I've often wondered what TERFs mean when they say they want to protect women's spaces. Because, what are those exactly? Bathrooms and locker rooms? Because, as mentioned earlier in this video, those have often been used as political tools of gender conformity, where butches and studs are often seen as an inherent threat. So whomst exactly are TERFs protecting? Because it certainly isn't all women. And considering one of the cheerleaders who sent me to the office for glancing at her in the locker room is now a TERF, I could take a guess at what they actually mean in practice when they say that. Any other women's spaces are spaces largely only accessible to white, middle-class women. Book clubs, sororities, and women's clubs are not generally populated by lower-class women. And there's only 30 lesbian bars left in the country. The fact of the matter is, lower-class cis women have always shared spaces with trans people, because they had to. Trans people often worked the same minimum wage jobs that lower-class cis women did, because these were the only places that would hire them. Trans people and lower-class women often engaged in sex work or drug dealing to make ends meet. The issue here is not cis women suddenly having to interact with trans women, as TERFs describe, because that's nothing new. It's middle-class cis white women who now have to share a bathroom with the trans girl working IT in her office because trans women now have more opportunities. Suddenly, these white women can't maintain their exclusive Mean Girls Club, and that pisses them off. As much as TERFs go on and on about sex-based oppression and conservatives talk about basic biology, they and their ideologies have created very narrow definitions of what men and women are in practice. And anyone who falls outside of that is considered less than. We, as trans people, didn't create the gender spectrum. Y'all did. Society, specifically white Western society, decided that men and women were on a spectrum, and that the further you strayed from your assigned box, whether through choice or simply the physical features you were born with, the worse you were to be treated. Y'all aren't mad that we are saying gender is a spectrum. That is something y'all were already enforcing. What y'all are mad about is that we have reclaimed that spectrum as a tool of our own liberation. Y'all aren't mad that trans women are calling themselves women, or trans men are calling ourselves men, or that non-binary people exist at all. Y'all are mad that you can't ascribe the labels you want to us anymore. Freaks. Monsters. Ogres. Now, let's talk about those butch TERFs that I mentioned earlier in the video. Because of all the TERFs I mentioned in this video, I do have the most compassion for them. I think a lot of these women have found their womanhood to be a hard-earned victory against society. that they had to come to terms with their womanhood despite society at large telling them who they should be and how they should act. Life as a butch woman is difficult, and I'm glad to see so many butch women find contentment in their bodies and presentation. And I would never want to take that from them. I have a great deal of empathy for that. The issue is when they start stepping on the autonomy of trans men and non-binary people because they think we should do the same. As a related side note, TERFs also tend to be against cosmetic surgery in general, stating that people should just learn to accept their bodies. But where's that line drawn? Because I have body modifications outside of my transition. I have piercings and tattoos, and I put those on my body simply because I liked the way they looked. Some people split their tongues. Some people go to the gym for hours every week. Are they some sort of affront to God? What do you think, Jesus? That's what I thought. God is dead, and RuPaul killed him. I got rid of my breasts because I didn't like them. It wasn't some symbolic gesture of casting off my womanhood. I just never really liked them, and they caused me a great deal of distress. I started taking hormones because I wanted a beard. I thought I'd look good with one. And though I have not been granted that particular gift, I found that taking testosterone makes me really happy, as if it was a chemical that was always missing from my body. A big TERF talking point is that trans men only transition to escape the patriarchy. And what if I did? I don't think I did, but even if I did, what are you gonna do about it, Joanne? What does it matter if I transitioned because of rape trauma or abuse or because my dad left? Maybe I was born this way. Maybe I was made this way. The reality is that I am this way and that there's nothing wrong with that. Why do you care? You're a stranger. You aren't concerned about me at all. My existence and the way I choose to live simply upset you. It shakes up your worldview. Queer people have been shaking people's worldview for generations. But at the end of the day, it isn't your business. That's why you've had to focus in on trans youth, a topic we will discuss in a later video. Because when you talk to grown-ass adult trans men, your argument unravels at the seams. The fact is, we exist. And whether we were born this way or made this way, it doesn't matter, because we are this way and we deserve to be left alone and to have autonomy over our own lives and bodies. What do I care if it's against the natural order of things? I grew up in rural Appalachia, and let me tell you, the natural order of things is fucked, and it will kill you if given the chance. That's why my grandpa made me learn to shoot the bow. Natural isn't inherently good, and unnatural isn't inherently bad. And if your entire ideology is based upon what's natural without taking into account the health and autonomy of the people you loudly proclaim you see as women, then I seriously doubt how much you actually care about the health and autonomy of women at all. What you're practicing isn't feminism. It's an ideology of disgust, of body horror. We are the creatures that stalk your nightmares. An inherent other that you can't even try to understand and won't even listen to. After all, why listen to an ogre? And because we aren't listened to, it is very difficult to convince doctors and politicians that many of us need the ability to transition, that we require it, that at the end of the day, no matter why we are like this, we are like this, and any level of conversion therapy isn't going to change that. The fact is, whether we medically transition or not, TERFs and conservatives are never going to see us as people. They want us to fold ourselves into something they can easily understand. As much as they accuse us of mutilating ourselves, they have never had an issue cutting away at the pieces of us they find frightening or inconvenient. Gender is complicated, and there simply is no one-size-fits-all easy answer, as much as TERFs and politicians and Matt Walsh would like to think so. Gender is multifaceted and full of layers. You know, like an onion. Most trans people I know have never had that moment so often portrayed in media where they saw their mother's red high heels and they just knew they were a woman. In fact, most trans people I've met instead have a deep longing simply to be themselves, and the labels come later. Whether they chose those labels themselves or they were forced onto them by people who wanted to make their gender nonconformity the butt of a joke. While this isn't the experience of all trans people, and I certainly don't discount anyone who has had the red high heels experience, for many of us it is far more gradual than that. A feeling that a bunch of different things just don't fit, that our gender is an ill-fitting suit. And for many trans people, trans men especially, this really sets in around puberty, when our bodies are no longer perceivably androgynous. This realization is often described as rapid onset gender dysphoria by TERFs, as well as the parents of many trans masculine people, since girls tend to have a bit more freedom of gender expression through childhood. But if you stop to think about it for literally 2 seconds, of course that onset of gender dysphoria is going to be rapid. Puberty hits you like a ton of bricks. And all of a sudden, a bunch of children are realizing their body is developing in a way that causes them immense distress, or that they've been placed in a box that feels far too restrictive for them to thrive in. Now, is transition the answer for every person with body issues? No, of course not. And I think people should really think hard and do their research before making such an important life decision. A creator on TikTok by the name of fairy.puss said, "I didn't decide to be trans. You decided I was." And I can't agree more with that statement. Society looked at me and assigned he/him pronouns when I was 12. It was only when I decided to claim those as my own that those same people started having a problem. It was only when I decided to take control of my own life and my own body and my own narrative it became an issue. Because then I couldn't be the butt of the joke anymore. I was in on it, liberated by it. Transition has granted me autonomy, not because I had a desire for power or upward mobility, but because the very white women who flushed my wigs down the toilet at school now grant me slightly more gentleness. Because to them, a butch woman is more of a threat than a gay man. If I transitioned to escape anything, it was TERFs and other neoliberal white women and the ideology they represent specifically. They were the ones who looked at me and the changes I wanted to make to my body and the way I wanted to dress and assigned me the label and social role of man while I was a literal child. So when y'all ask yourselves why I can't just be a butch woman, it's because I'm certainly not going to start identifying with something fundamentally opposed to my nature just to make you happy. You treated me like a monster my entire life until I decided to take control of my own story, at which point you decided I was a sniveling infant incapable of making my own decisions. Defining myself as a man is not an attempt to assimilate into masculinity, but is instead a demand to be treated as a human being, as entirely and wholeheartedly who I want to be. Shrek is, at the end of the day, a story about rejecting assimilation, about being happy with who you are, even if people look upon who you are with fear and disgust and a lack of empathy. I am happy with who I am, and I've found people in my life who like me for who I am. People who are okay with me being an ogre and doing ogre shit, and who aren't frightened of me for just being myself. People who give me the kindness and gentleness that I was denied but always deserved. I am not your pitiful girl trying to escape the patriarchy. I am not your long-lost lesbian sister. I am a grown-ass adult who is more than capable of making decisions about my life, my body, and my future. I am all the things you say about me in the dark corners of your forums. I am the gossip in the boardroom with my coworkers. I am every rumor in the women's locker room, and if that frightens you, good. Stay scared. Die mad. And get the fuck out of my swamp. Hello, you guys. Thank you so much. I hope you really liked this video. For those of you who don't know yet, Church of Mothman is teaming up with First Congregational UCC of Huntington in order to do the Warm and Fed campaign. Also gracious enough to let Church of Mothman essentially exist in their building, which means Church of Mothman now has a permanent home. The Warm and Fed campaign, essentially we are trying to get winter supplies for people who don't have the money to get them or may be unhoused this holiday season. I'm going to provide a link to my link tree down below in the doobly-doo down there. And with that, you'll be able to find all the links you need. There's an Amazon wishlist page where you can buy gloves and peanut butter and, you know, all the supplies we need to help these people get what they need this holiday season. If you guys haven't checked it out yet, my podcast is up and running, and I'm going to be launching a second podcast coming this January, hopefully. I know I'm awful at deadlines, but it should be out in January, and that's going to be the official Church of Mothman podcast. I'm going to have some musical guests. I'm going to be doing sermons. I hope you really, really enjoy it. I also am going to be starting evening services at the UCC of Huntington and preaching live there. So if you live in the Huntington area, please, you know, stop by, see us. We'd love to have you. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and you have a wonderful day. I love all of you, and thank you so much.